Friends, we're going to get ourselves started, and just want to say, first and foremost, thank you all for being here. This is such an important series because every time you go through such an amazing change as we've been going through with an election and polarization and all the difficulties we're experiencing internally and externally, it really behooves us to go back to our deepest resources and to see how people made their way forward at similar times and places. So I am so excited for Professor Estes to give his talk today on the grace and the DNA. I think it's the Episcopal DNA. Is that today's?
That's next time.
That's next time. Stay tuned for the Episcopal DNA. But today is going to be about grace and about moderation, and he's going to be doing a very close read. And what's also exciting for me is Brian Estes, Professor Estes' son, is running the camera upstairs. So this is like bring your son or bring your dad to work day. So will you all join me in thanking Professor Estes for being here?
Thank you very much, Father Bill, for that kind introduction. Welcome to all of you. It's great to be here, and I'm glad so many people are here. Can you all hear me fine through the mic?
Yes.
Okay, very good. What we wanted to do, and I was talking with our clergy this summer and fall, was to maybe talk about some programs that might show a way of connecting American history with the broader themes of the church and what we're working on and talking about in sermons and classes and things this fall here at Christ Church. And what we decided to come up with was a series of 3 programs, the first of which is today, where we talk about the role of political moderation. And as I want to suggest to you, the crucial role that moderation played in helping to get the Constitution ratified. And I've got a number of handouts for you. So there's a packet of information that you should have that has things like this chart, which I want to talk about quite a bit today, because this chart in some ways is the key to the whole thing. And if you can explain this chart, you can explain ratification, because in a sense it's all here. And we want to talk about that today. Next week, since we talked this week about an example of when moderation worked, next week we'll talk about the question of why doesn't moderation work all the time? Or why does it seem to fail us when we often most need it? And so we'll talk about the characteristics of moderation, the sort of essential preconditions that are there for that. We want to talk about some things that may be missing at times when moderation is not present in our politics and when that seems to fail us. And then our third lecture, I think it's next week, and then a couple weeks after that, we'll have a break in there in early December. But December 8th, I think it is, we'll take a look at the Episcopal DNA in the American founding and consider the fact, something I think we can take a lot of denominational pride in, which is that half or more of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were Episcopalian. And many of our most prominent early officers of government were also Episcopalian, including people you've heard of like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and John Marshall and many more. Washington and Jay and others were vestrymen at their respective churches. So we want to talk about, sort of play with that idea of whether or not there is something about Episcopalians being in leadership positions that had something to do with the moments of the founding, and think about the reality of that Episcopalian dominance in some way in high political office holding in Congress, in the presidency, in the Supreme Court, and other elements. So that's where we're going with this series. And again, I want to thank Father Bill and Father Chris and Pastor Manisha for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. This is something I talk about all the time. My son, as Father Bill mentioned, has heard about this way more than he wants to. My long-suffering wife is happy that I'm off playing with others today and talking about this, so she doesn't have to listen to this as well. But I do want to sort of walk through a couple things today about this. And we'll start, if you have the outline with you, I'm pretty much going to stick to this so you've got a sense of where we are and where we're going and what's coming next. I'll probably talk for maybe a half an hour or so, and I'll really have to restrain myself because I love to talk about this, but I will reel it in today. And then we want to leave the rest of the time for questions, for conversation, for things you might want to ask about what we've talked about or things we haven't talked about here. So I want to begin with this picture, which you have a copy of on your chart, and I thank the folks here at Christ Church for reproducing this in color, because I think the colors may help us see things a little bit. This is essentially ratification in one picture. Can you see through me? Okay. All right.
It's a good problem. We're out of outlines.
Right about, oh, no, okay, that's a good thing. What we have here is essentially where the position over the constitutional debate stood in 1787. As you know, the Constitution was written at Philadelphia, then sent to the states to be ratified. So each of the states had to have its own convention to decide whether or not to ratify the Constitution and therefore join the emerging Union. The two sides, as I'm sure you recall from school, were the Federalists who supported ratification. Some of their prominent supporters were people like Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, who was one of Washington's generals, John Jay, Wilson, Madison. Almost all of the newspaper press was heavily behind the Constitution. So the press was, like 80% of the newspapers were strongly pro-ratification. Only about 20% were anti-ratification. And then on the right-hand side, you see the opposition of the anti-federalists, those who opposed ratification or wanted to change things before they ratified. And you see some big names there as well: Patrick Henry, George Mason, John Hancock, Sam Adams. These were people who were prominent figures and prominent citizens. And for much of the early debate, things were sort of locked in place. You had the Federalists who were insisting that they ratify the Constitution, which, as you'll also probably remember, did not include amendments. There was no Bill of Rights in the original Constitution. There were no guarantees of protection for rights, and so that became a major sticking point in the debate. The Anti-Federalists insisted that they either could not accept the Constitution as it was, or wanted to wait and add amendments first, and then send it back through the process to be ratified. Now, again, in a nutshell, what happens, and this is what I want to make the point I want to make today, and the point I'll make in a larger project I'm doing, is to talk about what happened. Because ultimately, the Federalists were locked on their side of the debate. The Anti-Federalists locked on their side. And by late 1787, this middle ground didn't exist. Or rather, it existed, but it was empty. It was open. There was nobody there. And finally, with the Massachusetts Convention in January of 1788, for the first time, Federalists added a wrinkle, and they gave delegates at the convention the opportunity to ratify the convention, but then recommend amendments that would be sent to the first new National Congress after the Constitution was up and running. And that Congress would then consider the amendments and figure out which ones would be added to the Constitution. Ultimately, as we know, they did that, and those first 10 amendments became what we know as the Bill of Rights. But that did not finally get ratified until 1791. But with Massachusetts, the key distinction was that delegates on both sides essentially relaxed their stances. They dropped their sort of hardball insistence on don't touch the document, ratify it as it is, or we have to do, before we can ratify anything, we have to have amendments guaranteed at first. Moderation, I want to suggest, created the movement that allowed Federalists to reach out to Anti-Federalists and say, how about if you recommend amendments that you'd like to be taken up? And it allowed Anti-Federalists to meet them at that level and say, well, with these amendments, we could see ourselves ratifying the Constitution. With those amendments, we could see this happen. So, in a nutshell, what happened was, and the arrows on this chart are the key things, I think. The arrows show the direction of movement of Federalists stepping into the center of the spectrum, offering the right to recommend amendments, sort of dropping their insistence on it's this way or nothing. And the Anti-Federalists met them there as well, so that you have a number of individuals who go from being Anti-Federalist to supporting ratification. You have a number of state conventions that probably would have voted against the Constitution, but with amendments, they ended up voting for it. And so you sort of see where things stood in 1787 when these things are extremely polarized. And then you see where, with the influence of moderation, by 1788, we get this middle ground that's created, this common ground where Federalists and Anti-Federalists can join together. They didn't solve all their disputes, they didn't agree on everything, but they found enough common ground and agreement to sign and ratify the Constitution in state after state after state. Now, we've heard the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I'm right now finishing up a book manuscript that's about 100,000 words that essentially will explain this chart and how it started and what the movement is about and where it goes from. And I think the only illustration that I plan to put in this book is some variation of this chart. This is from the artwork of Todd Estes. And you can see it's a good reason, there's a good reason I'm an historian and not an artist. But it's, I hope, clear enough and good enough to sort of get us through and talk about that. So we'll come back to that chart at several points because it's important. But again, in a nutshell, I think that's what happens over time with ratification. Now, I'm going to step to the side here and have a sip of water and continue with our outline and talk a little bit about the impact of this and how from the fall of 1787 to the summer of 1788, that's when this movement is taking place, and that brings about ratification. Now, if that's the what, the thing we still want to think about is the why and the how. How did this take place? And what I'd like to suggest to you is that political moderation is what drove this, that there had to be a change of heart and a change of tactics and a change of approach by Federalists and Anti-Federalists to bring about a resolution of this conflict, because otherwise the Constitution very likely would have been defeated. And then there might have been a second convention, but would that have been any better or more successful than the first? There still would have been disputes, and then perhaps there would have been not one union, but perhaps several separate confederacies. That's if they lasted long enough before some warring European power came in and said, you guys are weak, we'll take you over, and sent troops to do just that. So the stakes were enormous, and I think that makes the move toward moderation all the more significant, because it's the sort of thing that had to happen to ratify the Constitution and therefore preserve the Union and establish the new government. Now, what I'd like to go through a little bit here is to talk about moderation itself and define it. You know how professors always are, and I plead guilty to being a professor. We always like to tell people what things are not before we then tell them what they are. So let me sort of explain what moderation is not. It's not simply another word for centrism. That is the idea of, here are political parties, and somewhere in the middle, that's the center area, and we'll lay claim to that. It's not simply a splitting of differences. In other words, if one side wants $20 billion for a program and the other side wants $10 billion, then we say, well, let's settle at 15. That way, everybody's happy, or at least everybody's equally unhappy with that sort of deal. That's not really moderation, at least not the kind that I see being practiced at the time of the Constitution. Moderation, I believe, is a mindset. It's a mindset. It's a way of being. It's a way of thinking and a way of acting. It is a mode of action that has practical consequences and practical steps. Sometimes it's stylistic, we might say. It's the mere act of sitting down and having dinner, a Federalist and an Anti-Federalist, and saying, well, tell me what your concerns are. There must be something we can talk about here. It's Anti-Federalist and Federalist and the ratifying convention saying, take all the time you need, explain this issue, ask questions, let's talk this through. We're not trying to ram things down anyone's throat. We're not trying to insist that this is the only way things can be. Let's practice some dialogue. Let's have an opportunity to talk to people and meet them here. And of course, ratification and moderation, I should say, is also substantive. That is, it involves compromises, it involves agreements, it involves contrasts where people sit down and iron out those differences. Sometimes they take place on the floor of the convention. Sometimes they took place at the boarding houses where the various delegates were gathered at the state ratifying conventions and staying, because these were, in some cases, weeks or month-long ratifying conventions. So they were at it for a while, and they were trying to work their way through this. And it involves, as I said, all these different kinds of practices and ways of being that essentially look at your political opponents not as villains, not as enemies, not even as adversaries, but as people who are trying to find a practical way through to solve a problem and reach a solution. The word politician has, with good reason, a bad name. It's an insult to call someone, what, that so-and-so is just a politician. It's a term we often use and intend as an insult. But what I would suggest is that many of the people at these ratifying conventions were politicians in the very best sense of the term. They were trying to find ways through. They were trying to find solutions. They were trying to talk, and just as importantly, trying to listen. And just as importantly, trying to find a mechanism where everybody could be, as we would say, seen and heard, and have their concerns represented as well. And that involved making some real sacrifices on the part of both sides, so that Federalists would not get everything they wanted in exactly the right way, and Anti-Federalists wouldn't get everything they wanted in exactly the certain way, but that there would be a kind of, again, a common ground, a place where they could meet and physically talk and listen, even as they were debating the Constitution, but also a place where they could talk and listen and sort of work things out together. So moderation, again, is a mindset, it's a practice, it is a set of actions, it's a set of practices, both stylistic and substantive. And as we'll talk a little bit more next week, it's not always present, and it's not always reachable when we sometimes most need it. But it was reachable in 1787 and 88. And that is the reason I would suggest that the Constitution got ratified. Without that turn to moderation, I just don't see how it would have been possible. Maybe the best way, though, to talk about moderation is to read one of what I think of as the key documents of moderation, and that is an essay you have in your packet there, James Madison's Federalist 37. Federalist 37 is one of the famous Federalist Papers essays. It's not the best known, but I want to suggest maybe it should be, because it is really crucial, I think, to understanding James Madison's thought, and he was such a key player in the ratification process. But it's also important because I think in Federalist 37, there is an attempt to explain several things to the newspaper reading public. And I've underlined some key passages here in this document that I think are really important to understanding what the debate is about and how moderation can be practiced. I just want to highlight a few of these things that I have underlined here in this, because I think, again, Federalist 37, if I had to point to one document that sort of gave us an insight into how the founders thought about moderation, I think this one would be that document. So you can see that Madison starts off talking about how it's a misfortune that public measures are rarely investigated, he says, with that spirit of moderation, which is essential to a just estimate of the real tendency to advance or obstruct the public good. And then what Madison does is to go through a whole series of essentially reminders, where he's sort of teaching the public what the delegates had gone through at Philadelphia in the National Ratifying Convention. And so Madison talks there about how there were so many clashing interests that competed with each other. They had the large states and the small states. Each of them wanted different things, representation and power and things like that. You had northern and southern states, and they didn't see things eye to eye, not just on slavery, but on all kinds of other issues as well. Then you had various interests and attempts to try to reconcile stability and energy, as he calls it here. You want a stable government, but you have to also make provision for an energetic government if you're going to actually be able to meet moments of crisis and do things that are effective in that way. And again, he goes through many, many more of these kinds of discussions. And the clear themes of Federalist 37, again, you can read it for yourself. I urge you to take it home, read it closely, share it with your family at Thanksgiving, Xerox it, let your neighbors have copies, because it is really, I think, a key document for getting inside Madison's mind. If I'm right about this, in some of the work I'm doing, I want to suggest that Federalist 37 is actually hugely insightful to the way James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, thought about the Constitution. And because Madison played such a huge role not only in this debate, but a huge role in the new government, first in Congress, and then in the cabinet, and then as president, it makes sense that we should understand what Madison did and how he thought and how he went about things. But the clear themes of this essay, and again, you can read this at your leisure, moderation, reciprocity, humility, and the need for compromise. That's effectively what Madison is calling on. He's saying that's what we did at Philadelphia, and that's what you, the newspaper reading public, and that's what those of you in the state ratifying conventions need to do as well. Moderation, reciprocity, humility, and the need for compromise. Federalist 37, I think, is also autobiographical, because Madison himself was bitterly disappointed at some of what made it into the convention at Philadelphia and some of the stuff that was left on the cutting room floor. So when Madison left the convention, he was as distressed as many others about what the Constitution looked like. And so he had to sort of talk himself through that process of thinking, well, maybe this isn't as bad as I thought. Maybe this will work better than I expect. And maybe that element is not going to be as problematic as I once thought it might be. So Madison went from being a kind of reluctant supporter of the Constitution initially because of his objections at Philadelphia to a very strong supporter. But I think he had to bring himself around by practicing, if you will, what he preached here in Federalist 37. Federalist 37, and now I get to use one of my favorite words. Federalist 37, I would suggest, captures the zeitgeist of the moment, right? The spirit of the times, the spirit of the era. And I say that it captures the zeitgeist because this was published January 11th, 1788. And the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention had started 5 days before that. Now, we've got to be careful about arguing for causation. And I want to be careful to suggest that it's not that people read Federalist 37 and said, oh, it's moderation, let's do that. Rather, I think moderation had been floating around out there in private correspondence, in discussions, in notes and letters people wrote to each other, in conversations they were having. The idea for it, the impetus for it was growing. And I think Madison's essay captured that spirit perfectly. It sort of met the moment, if you will, the zeitgeist of the times, and it describes what Federalists in Massachusetts were doing already and continue to do to achieve ratification there. We have time, I think, for one more discussion of another key document and another key leader, and that's a piece written by John Jay, a very prominent New Yorker who was also an author of the Federalist Papers. He wrote actually 4 of the first 5 essays of the Federalist. Then he got sick and sort of stepped away for a while, then came back and wrote 1 more later. But in April of 1788, Jay published, and I did not provide a copy of this because I didn't want to give you too much stuff to overwhelm you, but if you're interested, write to me. I'll be happy to give you copies. I've got many. I can give them to you annotated, unannotated, with my own notes, without notes, a clear copy, whatever you want. I've got tons of this stuff, and of course, I am happy to share it. But let me talk a little bit about what Jay said and how that provides another example of moderation in action. Jay wrote an essay called, and not a very exciting title, A Citizen of New York, in which he's talking about the Constitution and the challenges faced in New York and what he's trying to do. In that address, which was published widely throughout New York and sent around the country as well, Jay called for calm, dispassionate assessment of the Constitution. He was almost sympathetic in his critique of the Articles of Confederation, which of course the Constitution was going to replace, by saying, well, look, don't blame the authors of the Articles. They did the best they could. They were trying to fight a war at the time. They were trying to establish state governments. They made a good faith effort, but they missed some things, and we have a chance now to revise matters. We have a chance now to shift things and change things a bit. He asked the question of whether or not, if there was to be a second convention to sort of meet and revise what people had suggested, whether that convention would be as effective as the Philadelphia Convention had been. Would there be that spirit of harmony and agreement? Because one of the things that happened at Philadelphia, and Madison and Jay both talked about how the states needed to duplicate this effort, people had to settle for less than everything they wanted. They had to agree with things they didn't fully agree with. They had to swallow some things and say, well, I'm uncomfortable with this, but you're giving me this aspect that I want. I can give you that aspect. Neither one of us is fully happy, but we can make that work because we need to preserve the Union and we have to do things in an amicable way. And so what John Jay did in this address was, again, to talk about the important work that the convention had done in Philadelphia, to talk about how hard that process was, how difficult and challenging it was. And he began to ask the question, now, in the spring of 1788, could we have a second convention? Would it actually work? Would it be possible? Could it do a better job than the first convention? And Jay's answer was across the board, no. It really won't work. It's too late. There's not enough time for that. There's too much contentiousness. We have to give in and compromise and practice moderation. And then both men, having written these documents, were both parts of their state ratifying conventions. Madison was the leader of the Federalist effort in Virginia. And in that, Madison was tireless. He stood up and rebutted every objection that Patrick Henry made, and Patrick Henry made a lot of objections. There was nothing about the Constitution that Henry liked, and so Madison had to answer that and rebut those charges. But he also took up the questions of those delegates who said, well, maybe I could support this, but I'm not convinced. I'm not there yet. Help me get there. And so Madison sat down with people, informally and formally, and talked with other delegates and said, well, this could be that way, and this might work out for this reason. So Madison performed that kind of moderation on the floor and off the floor as well. And in the end, Virginia came to ratify the convention. The largest, most populous state in the Union came to ratify the convention, narrowly, but they got there, in part because of moderation. And after the convention was over, after the vote had been taken, Patrick Henry, and you'll note that there is no arrow by Patrick Henry. He never left the anti-federalist bunker, we might call it. He never left that anti-federalist position. So he doesn't move to the other side like some other Virginia anti-federalist. But here's what Henry did. Once the convention was over, some of the other anti-federalist members in Virginia came to him and said, hey, we're not happy with this, you can't be happy with this. And they essentially said to Henry, do you want to start something? Because if you want to start something, we're right there with you. We'll grab our pitchforks and we'll go out there and rally around you. And Henry, to his eternal credit, said, no. We've had a fair discussion, we've had a fair vote, and we lost. And what Henry said is, now it's up to us to get ourselves elected to positions in this new government, work for change within the system, bring about some of the objectives that we want to obtain, but to do it peacefully, to do it legally, and to do it constitutionally. And so although Henry never converted to full-blown support of the Constitution, he also never admitted or moved over to chaos or anarchy or rebellion. And for other hardcore anti-federalists, some of them made that same decision. I don't like it, but I'm going to work to change it within the system and to do it constitutionally in that way. That's also, I think, an important exercise of moderation on Patrick Henry's part. Moderation, in other words, came around gradually. It was not the primary tactic of either side at the outset of the ratification debate. Federalists were trying to push this through to take advantage of the states where they had the votes and said, hey, we've got the votes, we'll just outvote you, let's get this done. They came to moderation in part because hardball wasn't working anymore. They were not going to be able to win more ratification votes. And so they weren't saints, I'm not suggesting that. They didn't have some great insight. In many ways, they were looking and acting politically and saying, we haven't persuaded people, we need to persuade them. But we can do that, and it's worth working to do that. So moderation emerged not at the start of the ratification debate, but in the middle. But I want to suggest that moderation was essential to achieving ratification in Virginia and New York and in all the states. One example of John Jay. Jay was, again, a jurist and a diplomat, and as we'll see in a couple weeks, an Episcopalian. And Jay sort of brought all that to his practice and performance in the New York Convention. Jay helped strike out this moderate position. He talked to people on the other side. He talked to them informally. He talked to them on the floor. At one point, Jay did something extraordinary in a debate where people were often trying to score points against their rivals. A delegate stood up to make an objection to the Constitution, and Jay stood up to rebut it. And Jay started to go into his argument and explanation to put down the guy's argument, and then Jay stopped, and he said, wait a minute, do I have you right? In other words, am I hearing you correctly? Are you saying X? And that anti-federalist delegate said, well, actually, Mr. Jay, no, I'm saying Y instead. And Jay said, oh, well, that changes things. Let me recalibrate a bit. And Jay began to still suggest a different way, a different point of view than his anti-federalist rival had brought up. But notice what Jay did in that interaction. He listened, then he asked and listened some more. He took in that information, he sort of recalibrated and decided, well, that's not what I was thinking, it's this. That makes a difference. And Jay at that point made it clear that although they were not totally in agreement, Jay performed a key act of moderation. That particular delegate, who's a guy named Melancton Smith, and I must say, Melancton is a fine name. It was not on the short list when we had Brian, so wasn't one of the finalists for naming our son. But Melancton Smith was the key anti-federalist who rallied other anti-federalists in New York to make the move to vote in favor of ratification with amendments. Melancton Smith is right here, staunch opponent of ratification. But he moves to the center, he brings other New York anti-federalists with him, and in doing so, Smith sort of provides what do they call it today? A permission structure, I think is the word, a permission architecture maybe, to give people the right to say, well, okay, I disagree, but if so-and-so says it's okay, then I've got permission to do that. That moderation was essential because although it's easy to think of Federalist and anti-Federalist, there were actually a good number of what we might call ordinary Americans who weren't totally for or against the Constitution. There was this notion, several people talked about at the times, of a spectrum of sentiments. People kind of not just here or there, kind of all over the place, but not in significant numbers. One delegate talked about how he was certain that there must be, as he called it, a middle walk to be trodden. A middle walk to be trodden. There must be some way of bridging this gap, he said. And another delegate said very famously, I am for it and against it, speaking of the Constitution, which no doubt captured a lot of people's minds because there were some parts of the Constitution they loved, other parts, either by design or omission, that they did not like. Political moderation also, and I want to preview a little bit of what we'll get into next week, but it fits here, so I want to talk about it as well. Political moderation, as one historian has noted, often arose, and it did so at the time of ratification, not from a subsidence of conflict, but rather it was a response mechanism, not because conflict's gone away, but rather because there's so much conflict that moderation becomes a response mechanism to manifestly destructive levels of partisanship and polarization. Now, I had to look to see if that was 1788 or 2024, because again, partisanship and polarization have not gone away, and they are still present. But at that time, moderation provided a way through that to sort of reconcile and heal those manifestly destructive levels of partisanship and polarization. The last point I think I want to make before we get into opening up for discussion and questions and comments you may have is to simply suggest that, and this is where I'm going to ask for your help. This is a book I'm writing by myself, but I'm always open for brilliant insights and brilliant questions and brilliant observations. And if you have those for me today, I will steal them shamelessly, add them in my book, and pass them off as my own, no doubt. But there is something about, I think about this I do want to think about here, because I don't quite have the right metaphor. Because what moderation does is it sort of unlocks a debate that had become sealed. or it liquefies a debate that had become frozen, or it breaks open a giant something that had become clogged. Now, those are 3 metaphors. I've played around with 15 more. None of them are fully satisfactory. So if anybody does have a good way of sort of describing what moderation does, liquefies what's become frozen, unlocks what has become sealed, uncovers what's been buried, something like that. If you have a good suggestion, please let me know. There's still time for me to put that in the book and get it just right. I don't think I'm there yet, and I need to get the right metaphor to describe these things. But the last thing, if we turn to our lecture outline, and I think I've got mine still somewhere here. Yeah. A couple more things just on the lecture outline to conclude. Moderation requires a number of things that we have heard in sermons from a number of people in our clergy here at St. James, and there were several in particular of Father Bill's sermons that I think this idea of moderation connects to as well. He talked this summer about grace and the role of grace and the importance of lowering your shoulder when you meet a rival or an adversary, of being open to conversation and discussion, of being in a position where you can listen and contribute without worrying so much about destroying the other person or winning an argument or those kinds of things. Moderation also, at the time of the Constitution, required a leap of faith, because Federalists had to do something they weren't crazy about. They really feared that amendments could wreck the Constitution before it ever got started. Just as Anti-Federalists were fearful that without amendments, the Constitution might create such a powerful, consolidated government that not only would people's rights and liberties be at risk, but it would simply become something other than a republic or a democracy. So both sides had to take a leap of faith to allow for the practice of moderation that led to the recommendation of amendments. In other words, to get from here to here, or to get from here to here, requires people to take a leap of faith. And I was struck as well, to connect this back to grace and to the church, I was struck as well by a sermon this summer that Father Bill officially called On Difficulty and Doubt. But I always think of it as the diving board sermon. Because if you saw that, if you were there for that, he put up that image of the diving board and that great film clip of this couple that we're talking about, should we jump or should we not? Should they jump off a high dive or not? And all the going through the arguments and positions there as to whether to take a leap of faith. And he asked us as congregants, as parishioners that day, what would our leap of faith look like? And I want to suggest in purely secular terms, if you will, that the debate over the Constitution involved that kind of a leap of faith, something serious, something substantive, something major, something prominent that people struggled with. Do I leap or not? Do I do it over this or over something else? How do I do it? What will happen? Will I be okay? Can I pull back? Should I pull back? Those things, I think, are remarkably important. And then, most recently, I think just last week, and again, as part of the 4 R's, as Pastor Manisha talked about today, we're working through this series of the 4 R's of the architecture of belonging and drawing on a number of sermons here as well. The work of repair is really important work as well. The work of repair. And if, in fact, that historian is right to refer to those incredibly destructive levels of partisanship and polarization that were at work in 1787 and 88, and if moderation provides a way out of that, then I think, again, that same kind of practice of repair can be brought about by moderation in other situations and in other instances as well. In our church life, in our private life, in our friends categories, at work life, all those kinds of situations where we have rivals or opponents or we're drawn into conflicts and tensions, I think moderation of the kind practice of the Constitution provides an example of how things can work, of what can be done, of the great results that can result from that. And so I think the ratification debate well, that's not the ratification debate, but that's the great scene that comes once it's ratified, right? Ratify the Constitution and it's all there. So that is again, sort of what I wanted to share with you today on moderation. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about the preconditions of ratification, what has to happen for moderation to really take off. And we'll talk a little bit more about some historical examples and answer that question of the lost art of compromise. Why doesn't moderation always work? Why is moderation not always present? And what does it require of leaders and of us, whether political citizens or members of a church or all the various communities that we're in? What is required of us in terms of moderation of our behavior and of those of others for us to achieve moderation, or to achieve, if you will, grace at our founding, as the lecture of this, the title of this lecture has been called. I thank you very much. I'm very happy to hear what you think. If you have questions, observations.
So I thank you so much, and honored that you would mention the clergy sermons. We're so blessed to have you and Kathy and Brian as part of our church. Thank you for joining us just recently. So just to make sure I understand, because, you know, I took this class 40 years ago. So here are the Republicans. What I was told were the Republicans, but they're now being called the Anti-Federalists, which is okay. I'm just noting it. And they tended to focus on individual rights, and they tended to focus on states' rights, and they tended to also have a more differentiated foreign policy. That was what I remembered from that. And then you have on this side the Federalists, and they wanted a little more of a collectivity and to create through the Constitution a stronger central government. And they also wanted closer ties to Britain. And they kind of wanted to see this as that way forward would be to kind of keep from getting just enough far away from Great Britain, but not falling again into war with them or something like that. Is that fair? Am I getting that right?
Very good.
Okay, so just wanted to make sure. Everybody on this too? Good. All right, I think we have Thomas and Claire, and let's do that and we'll keep moving.
So is there any connection ideologically or philosophically between the Federalists then and the Federalist Society now?
That's a great question, and the short answer is no. I would suggest the Federalist Society today should properly, ideologically, be called the Anti-Federalist Society. Because what the Federalists advocated, as Father Bill just said, was a very strong consolidated national government, peace abroad, a strong economy based on the economy and commerce, and centralized authority in that sense. And the Federalist Society today, of course, advocates, they've taken that name, but they've advocated policies that are far more in keeping with what Anti-Federalists had argued for during ratification. Mm-hmm.
So I studied this 40 years ago too, and I don't remember a thing.
You're busy, right?
I do remember the words to every Barry Manilow song I've ever heard, but none of this, and that's a fact. So you hinted at this, but I want you to stretch it out a little bit, which is if this debate after the Constitutional Convention was required, did the parties not know that this was coming? Was this a surprise to them that there was such disagreement? And why did they not bake that into their original conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. The mechanism for ratifying the Constitution that the Philadelphia Convention came up with, as you know, was to call state ratifying conventions, because they wanted to separate what they thought of as the people of the state from the state legislatures, who tended to be probably more anti-federalist than federalist. The Federalists at Philadelphia believed that it was going to be more likely that a state ratifying convention drawn up of delegates elected by the people, not their regular representatives, not their regular members of the state legislatures, but drawn from the people, would give this a fairer hearing, that they would be less concerned about, say, as they thought the state legislatures might be, of losing influence and power in this new system. That power would move up the scale to the national government, strip the states of some of their powers, and therefore leave the state legislatures less to do, or less money, or less authority. So the mechanism came along fairly late at the convention, because they said, we're going to draft this, and then toward the end they said, okay, how do we get this ratified? So sending it to the state legislatures would be one choice, but calling these ratifying conventions would be another choice, which they thought would be better and give sort of a truer, fuller sense. And every state did it differently. They called elections at different times. Some conventions like Massachusetts were enormous. Massachusetts convention kept meeting in churches in Boston because those were the biggest public buildings. But they had to go to 3 or 4 different churches to find one that would hold all the delegates, 300 and some, plus the audience, because people wanted to come watch and listen to this as well. So that mechanism of the state ratifying conventions comes sort of late in the convention, and no one's quite sure what will happen. So they did anticipate there would be some fallout and tension over this. But again, early on, the Federalists believed this is the way things need to be. They seemed to have the weight of the great names of the time: George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Madison, James Wilson, others were all on board with the Constitution. And so they believed that would sort of minimize conflict. My sense is they were surprised by how much division there was. And that's one of the reasons why they said, well, what do we need to do? And I think the turn to moderation came out of, again, a practical need to ratify the Constitution in a mechanism that was going to get it to achieve what they wanted. And moderation, I think, provided a vehicle to make it arguably a stronger document that more people could support. So they would not only win the ratifying conventions, but also achieve legitimacy for the new government that would come out of that.
I think what I'm going to do, we have 1, 2, 3. We're just going to do 3 pieces of feedback, and then we'll have you bounce off that. So
Okay.
Go ahead, Rob.
Have you noticed that formal education played any part in where these characters wound up on your chart?
And then 2. Oh, sorry.
I was wondering about, since most of the founding fathers were deists, what do you believe the spiritual formation was, the Christian spiritual formation was, that caused those to make a material difference in leadership to actually reach a consensus?
Great. And now 3, Dave.
I've always thought that moderation was a reaction to extremes. I ask you to consider this. In Virginia, Williamsburg, Bruton Parish Church was the home of 5 American presidents. The impact and influence of the Episcopal, the Anglican Communion on the Constitutional Convention of 1776, the first one, and then the subsequent activities, suggests that the Episcopal Church had an outstanding and an extreme influence on the creation of the American democracy. Would you comment on that?
Perfect. Thank you, Adam. Thank you. These are 3.
Yes. 3 great questions. Take them in order. Formal education of the delegates. Most of the delegates at the Philadelphia Convention, particularly, since those were sort of the cream of the crop around the country, were very well educated, very experienced. They had previously served, many of them, on continental congresses during the Revolution, or they had served in the Articles government, and they had high levels of education themselves. The same was generally true, I think we can say, of the delegates elected at the state conventions. But there were some of the very most I think powerful, striking speeches given at the state ratifying conventions were of people who stood up and essentially said, I'm just a farmer, I'm not formally educated, I don't know law or politics, but I think this Constitution will be good or bad, whichever side they would argue, for reasons that had nothing to do with schooling or political theory or things like that. So the interesting thing, I think the nice thing about those state ratifying conventions is they had a fairly broad mix of people there, probably far more educationally diverse, certainly, than you would find in the state legislatures or that you found at Philadelphia. But I think in terms of were the Federalists, the educated group, and the Anti-Federalists, the uneducated group, that's too simple, because there were some very bright people. I mean, George Mason, Nathan Dane, Smith is a smart guy. There are many of the leading Anti-Federalists who are quite knowledgeable, quite learned themselves. So I don't think it maps clearly onto one side or the other. But I do think that the education levels certainly do play a role in what happens at Philadelphia and then what happens in many of the state conventions as well. And it was always sort of a great achievement, a great get for many of those Federalists when they had essentially a self-admitted uneducated farmer stand up and say, I'm for this Constitution, I don't fear the wealthy, I don't fear well-educated, I don't fear leaders in the community, I think I can trust them, we can work with them. That was always considered a great achievement by Federalists, that they got someone who may not have fit their type, who came out and spoke for them. The second question about the spiritual formation of the founders, let me, if I could, the third lecture is going to be all about that. So I'd rather sort of defer my question to that and give it the time and attention it deserves, because it's a great question about deism and the founders, about Anglicanism and these kinds of things, and the sort of breakdown of the delegates, where they worshiped, how devout they were, what their individual practices were. And I want to talk a lot more about that in the third lecture in this series. So if I may, with respect, let me defer that, because it's a great question, but it's not one that I can get into in great detail now. But fortunately, there's a third lecture, a third part of the program, and I'll have plenty of time to get into it then.
You know, overarching kind of a,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, I guess the overarching thing I might say just now is it's clear that religion played a very important role in the individual lives of most of what we would consider the founders, however they defined that, whatever they thought of religion or spirituality, however they experienced it. It was very important for them individually. It did not always carry over into how they thought about law and politics and government. They were very good in many cases about sort of segmenting those things. Here's a religious influence, here's a political theory influence, here's an example from history that's drawn that we're brought to in that way. So I think in many ways, it is certainly fair to say that the founders as a generation were religious and spiritual. They differed on denomination and everything else. But I think in many ways, they considered themselves to be doing something, most of them, not all, but most of them thought they were doing something that was far more strictly legal, constitutional, secular, when they were writing these documents and writing these constitutions. So again, I'll defer and talk more about that in the third lecture this year.
So on this side, Todd, did you want to make?
Yeah, one more.
Yeah, one more, yep.
About the Anglican community. That too, I mean, I want to come back and talk about that because I want to talk about particularly Washington and Jay, who were two very devout, very serious, very committed Episcopalians, both vestrymen at their churches. Jay was, his father had been on the vestry, his grandfather had been on the vestry, so it was deeply ingrained in them. And I want to talk a little bit more about the way in which Anglicanism and Episcopalianism, as Jay helped change over to convert in the U.S., played a role in their politics, in their worldview, because it is very prominent. You're right about that. And again, I've got a whole series of things and examples set up and documents, which I don't have in front of me today, but I want to come back and talk about that. So I think it's December 8th is the schedule for the third talk, where we'll get into all these themes as well.
View it as the, you remember the end of the Batman TV show? Don't touch that dial. Come back. So we got three more people who want to say something here, and we're going to do those three, and we'll let those be the last questions this time. Obviously, crowd the professor afterwards. So
Yeah, certainly.
we'll start with Jason.
Thanks. So I'm curious if these people generally knew each other well personally and professionally, and if so, did any of those personal relationships play a part in forming the moderation?
Then the second one, Marty.
Explain the role that your premier moderating performer, Edmund Randolph, played.
Yes, excellent. And then Ernesti had a vision that he wanted to share, a definition that he developed for that he thinks will help the metaphor building.
Oh, good.
All right, just unload it right now.
So this is my call to your request for another metaphor for.
Yes.
And it is, moderation breaks, and it's inspired in the moment that you asked that. Moderation breaks wide open the group unconscious fear into the group willingness to the absolute universal truths for the commonality of unity.
Beautiful definition.
All right.
Yeah,
Wow.
great.
That's a
Right.
lot. That's great.
It's kind of Durkheimian. It's just like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just,
Thank you. Well, yes, thanks for that. That's a great, I want to maybe follow up with you on that and talk some more later, because that's really good. I'm trying to find this nice catchphrase that will sort of summarize this, but also summarize the broader arguments in this book I'm writing as well. Did the founders know each other, and did that influence the moderation? Yes, they did. They had previously served together in war. They had served together in local congresses, continental congresses. Some have been in business, not in the same firm, but they traded with each other or things like that. And one of the most fascinating parts of all the writings to read on the Constitution are the circles of correspondence that they have with each other, because they are, Madison, for example, Washington, correspond with everybody. And you read the letters to and from them, and you get a lot of insights into developing strategies and approaches. They sort of share intel on, oh, we're winning in this state, or we're losing in that state, or we need to find a way to break through here. So there's a lot of, in those correspondences, they really share a lot of ideas, a lot of political strategy, and they also just sort of pass along intelligence so they can be in touch with each other. So that forms some important pre-existing alliances that they had that carried over into ratification. And again, this was a generation that, unlike today, wrote letters all the time. I mean, just chronically. They devoted hours every day to writing letters. And usually those letters would say, I apologize for not responding to your letter of the 8th until now, but I had these 33,000 other things to do. So those letters are often deeply revealing, I've been able to find, of the strategy and the approach and the mindset, as well as the changing views on things like moderation, because that's definitely in the letters. Edmund Randolph. I put Randolph here with arrows in both ways. Randolph was governor of Virginia. As you may know, he presented the plan, which was actually James Madison's plan at Virginia, called the Virginia Plan. As the governor, he had the honor of doing that. And he presented the original plan for the Constitution. But Randolph became so disillusioned at the convention with that plan and with the Federalists in general that he refused to sign the Constitution. And so he goes back to Virginia and sort of wrings his hand and goes, well, what do I do? What do I do? And he's a big believer in having a second convention that will sort of solve all the problems. And Madison works on him and says, no, that's going to be a terrible idea. That's not going to work. And so Randolph goes back and forth and back and forth. No one can figure out where he is. Jefferson once called Randolph, and listen to this description, a chameleon on plaid.
That wasn't a compliment,
That
I
was
guess.
not a compliment,
No,
exactly.
good, yeah, just
A chameleon on plaid. And so finally Randolph gets up, and Madison's been working, trying to persuade him how bad a second convention would be. Just ratify this one with recommended amendments. And so on one of the first days of the Virginia Convention, Randolph gives this grand speech where he comes out and says, I'm a Federalist, I'm in favor of ratification with recommended amendments, that's the way to go, forget the second convention. So he sort of he's against it, then he's for it, then he's against it, he's for it. So I'm going to put Randolph right here in the middle of this graph, this spectrum, because I'm not sure, he doesn't belong in any place. And if anything, Randolph sort of starts in the middle and goes there. So it's a strange progress. And the last thing, again, was just the idea of the metaphor. So I thank you for that. Seriously, if any of you want to, I know we're out of time for today. I thank you so much for your attention. If anyone wants to talk afterwards, I'm happy to stick around. My email, very simply, is Estes, my last name, @oakland.edu. I would be delighted to have email correspondences, not formal letters, I guess, but email letters, or formal, either one.
And I didn't mean to cut off Thomas from a follow-up,
Yes.
but it's 12:45, so
Oh, yeah,
we just
you gotta
have
go.
to stop. But please come up, and would you all join me? I thought this was so cool and so important and so necessary.